4 decades, since the 70s, society has started to need solutions and posing problems on the environmental side. Science has proceeded by going deeper and deeper into specializing subjects. But we are trying with this project to do something which is not available elsewhere. That's what the ITN programs are about. Evaluators have identified an area where the society needs an input of a new generation of young scientists who can talk a new language, a strongly interdisciplinary language. We are trying to bridge, very simply, between that part of engineering which study the movement of water, in particular surface waters, bridging between this competence and another very important competence, which is ecology. We will build a new type of scientist, an environmental scientist specifically focusing on the interaction of fluids with solids, organic, inorganic, living and non-living matter. This is where the word interface, which is probably the most important keyword of our project, comes into play. Because wherever a fluid is in contact with something else, there is an interface there, of course.
Progress in science is not a linear process, but it's rather achieved by knowledge shifts. Thus, for a long period, we have slow progress, and then new ideas or new methods enable a rapid increase in the knowledge, and then we go another period where progress is slow, and so on and so on. What high-tech tries is to foster such a knowledge shift in the environmental sciences by training young scientists in an international and interdisciplinary network which creates interactions between physics and ecology. I'm an ecologist and think that this is a great opportunity to initiate significant progress in our understanding and in the management of our river ecosystems.
The Marie Curie programme is one a really interesting European Union funded research programme that just focuses on people rather than individual research projects. So it's all about taking the best young researchers and developing them in a very supportive environment, getting them to work with researchers in different universities across different countries from different disciplines as they make their way through their PhD training.
PhD students are supposed to write the PhD, work on that topic, but a very important part is the connection between the, in high-tech, 11 years olds. Research can not only be done by one single person, but you always need colleagues from your own topic, but also from related topics to discuss special things. So yeah, I think in research, in science, it is very, very important to have a network, a net, where you always find someone, if you have a question, to ask, to discuss, to go on studying this topic.
different terms. The first one is the important one because, as I said,
The objective of this Marie Curie action is to create a group of people belonging to different kinds of institutions, research centers, universities, private companies that will work together for a joint project during a few years. And one of the main objectives is to create a joint research question that involve different partners of the network and to create new collaboration between institutions of different European countries.
Each entity has one or more of these researchers, and these researchers are working in a project, and then they are supposed to cooperate and to work during a so-called secondment period in another university of the network. And this is important because in this way, the different topics on which the different entities are working are connected by the work itself of the researchers.
When I did my PhD, which is quite some time back now, most projects were highly disciplinary. That means biologists worked in biology. A physicist works on hydrodynamics. But those people would rarely work together. And what HITEC does is it offers the PhDs that work within the project to collaborate at an early stage on between the different disciplines. Within HITEC, one important mechanism is that we have regular meetings.
Twice a year, basically, we all meet for 1 week or more than 1 week. The fellow work together, the fellow listen to lessons. We have meetings, we have presentations, and these are important parts of the project, undoubtedly. The personal relation development is part of this, but the scientific networking is also part of it. A lot of ideas have been growing during this month among older researchers and younger researchers, by sure.
Students attend special classes and then have practical training in different areas. First summer school was in Bradford about statistical applications. Second school was in Aberdeen about fluid mechanics and environmental fluid mechanical applications. Then we had third school in Lyon about stream ecology with focus on ecological aspects. The next summer school was in Braunschweig about instrumentation. And finally we have in Castelfranco, where the idea is to try to build up on all these skills developed until now in relation to addressing complex problems with multiple involvement of multiple aspects coming from biology, from ecology, from hydrology, hydraulics, fluid mechanics, focusing on case studies of particular problems. And the whole of this package will give our early stage researchers a significant component of their training for development of their future careers in many different areas. I hope that most of our early stage researchers will continue their work in research area. They all demonstrated advanced commitment, significant commitment to research, strong motivation, and I personally think it would be highly beneficial for Europe, for our scientific community and for international community in general, if they stay in science and transfer this knowledge, develop their own careers and transfer this knowledge to a new generation of scientists.
group is trying to study how to protect aquatic vegetation and how to promote the restoration of aquatic vegetation. And in order to do this, we need to understand what we call the biogeomorphic feedbacks. So when vegetation is present, it will change the flow pattern in the channel. And the changes in the flow pattern, and again, in particular, creating regions of lower velocity or higher velocity, will create regions where there's either more or less deposition occurring. Where more deposition is occurring, and in particular, if we can deposit fine material that has a lot of high in nutrients and organic matter, that creates an environment that is very good for the plants. Low flow, lots of nutrient availability, the plants will be promoted to grow further. So to understand that feedback between presence of vegetation, changes in the flow, changes in the deposition, changes in the growth pattern, we need to have a multidisciplinary approach because it involves different disciplines.
Hydrodynamics is the study of water in motion, or fluid in motion. In the context of plants, it's relevant because there is a feedback loop between the motion of the water and the motion of the plants. So, for example, water might be coming down from upstream, makes the plants move, but the motion of the plants also moves the water. So you have a cycle, a feedback loop.
The motion of water exerts a force on the plants and the plants respond to that force. So if I push you, you will resist. It's a normal thing. The same thing is done with plants. My research topic is the theoretical framework needed to describe the flow-biota interaction. By flow, I mean water motion, and biota, I mean the plants or the mussels that may be present on the bed of a river. That means that I have to develop a set of equations that can be used to describe the fluid motion and its interaction with biota, plants or mussels.
So the main aim of our research group is to study vegetation motion and the coupling between the flow and the motion of vegetation. I'm working on the practical experimental side of the research. My colleague Kostas is doing a theoretical numerical framework that underpins the motion of vegetation and sediment transport. So
I would need data from experimental or numerical investigation, such as the investigation that HEMIS does, to develop models or to develop this set of equations that are used to describe this interaction.
In terms of my actual experimental work, basically we are going out into the field to perform a number of different studies using advanced experimental systems. So, for example, to transport all the equipment, we require a 7.5-ton truck and a team of 8 to 10 people to move everything and set it up. One day of experiments in the field involves the whole team assembling in the morning at between 5 and 6 a.m. Then the team departs from the lab, goes down to the field, everything is unloaded. The support structures are mounted in the banks of the river, and then the bridge is placed across the river or into the river. After that, all of the lasers and camera systems are installed and set up and tested, and then after that we can begin measurement. So it's a significant process to have the equipment set up, usually 4 to 6 hours of setup time.
It usually involves measurements with Vectrinos, ATV, or PIV. I help HEMIS in his PIV experiments. By PIV, I mean measuring velocities through particle imaging velocimetry.
Which involves a laser sheet shining down into the water and cameras imaging the laser sheet through a glass-bottom boat, and from that we can resolve the fluid motion and turbulence in very high resolution. sediments. So we have both the measurements of the motion of the vegetation and of the turbulence and the motion of the fluid. We can learn a lot more about the actual interactions between the fluid and the vegetation. The intercouple between the different organisms, fish, plants, the flow, sediment transport, it's a very large area of complicated systems, but understanding that, then we can create government policies that will help to improve the ecosystem in the future.
And therefore there is the need for people to restore these areas from effects done by human intervention in these areas. For that to be done, you need to know the physics, you need to be able to design restoration, get nature back, get the site back to an equilibrium.
There is ongoing research about the deposition, so depositing of fine sediment inside, around and behind aquatic plants. And it has been found that some of those sediments have higher levels of nutrients. So it may be that the plants are depositing sediment and then absorbing the nutrients, and it's allowing them to grow more, which means that fragments can break off and then colonize further downstream. So they're improving their probability of survival and their probability of passing on genes to future offspring. But this is an ongoing area of research, and our colleagues in Lyon are working on that currently.
Due to main activity, for example, agriculture or industry, we release nutrients in the water. And in this case, the nutrient level rise at levels that are not normal. And the condition change. And for example, you will have algae instead of aquatic plants. I study how aquatic plants in river influence sedimentation and flow dynamics, and how this interaction affect the plants themselves. And I also look at how the nutrient level in the ecosystem affect all these interactions. I go in the field and I study how different morphology and structure of vegetation affect flow dynamics and sediment dynamics, and how these affect the plants themselves. I measure flow velocity and turbulence along the length of the vegetation. I take sediment carrots and I sample interstitial water to measure the nutrients in the system. And I will take a sample to bring back in the lab and to analyze it for nutrients. And finally, I measure the morphology, the shape of plants, to have an idea of how these affect this interaction with the flow dynamics and the sediment dynamics, and how these interactions affect the plants in the two ways. As these interactions are very complex, just taking one interaction at a time is like simplifying the system, but what is interesting is to make a step more and try to look to all the interaction in one time to have a bigger view of what's happening around aquatic plants. It's complex, it's challenging, but it's really interesting.
I work with aquatic plants that grow in rivers, and what I'm interested in is understanding how these plants can modify their habitat, which sometimes can be very stressful. What I look at is how biodiversity is supported by interactions between plants and water. This kind of research is important to understand how to maximize the diversity of the river. For example, how to have the highest amount of species possible, because there are some species that can modify the environment more than others. And in this way, they will improve the conditions for many other plants or animals, etc. I'm usually working with students who help me during my experiments. We start by measuring the flow velocity with instruments that are called ADVs, like for example the Vectrino, which is usually mounted on a structure that will keep it upright in the water. We measure at different depths in the water column to see how the flow velocity is affected by a plant, for example, that is just standing at a certain height in the water. We then, for example, we can link the flow velocity that is incoming on the plants with the uptake of nutrients, for example. So we can understand how the location of different plants can affect the availability of nutrients for other plants. Or we can, for example, link the flow velocity with the amount of sediment that will be deposited in the plants. What is very common to think is that it's environmental conditions that determine where a species will grow, for example. But with this research, we actually show how plants or other animals are able to change their environment. And in this way, we kind of have another perspective to the way we look at organisms. Still a lot is to be known. For example, now we are understanding how these kind of feedback processes work between plants and a stress factor, how plants are responding and how these multiple interactions occur. So I think it's really important to understand what are the conditions in which plants can live, how are plants able to respond to this condition, how they can improve them, and how we can maintain a healthy ecosystem where we don't lose key species that will support the whole community. So also for a conservation perspective, I think it's really important to continue in this field.
So when you study the plants or you study the water in a river, you always have to take into account that they are flowing on the bed of the river. And what is the bed made of? It's made of sediment. So with the word sediment, what we intend is all the stones, sand, clay, all the things that are on the bed, so makes all its boundaries. We studied the motion of these particles and how they move because they are pushed by water. So you can't consider just the surface of the bed river made of stones. You also have to look into it. And that's what my experiment is looking at. So what I'm studying here in this experiment is how this sediment moves downstream, but at the same time interact in the bed. So going not just downstream, but also up and down. So it's one of the first experiments that actually looks at the interaction of the sediment in this permeable layer that is the bed of any river. So to study this kind of motion, so not just the downstream motion, but also the interaction with the deeper layer, I need a very long time experiment. And if you think of a straight flume, once the sediment got to the far end, it's been recirculated, so it's not a natural environment. So to do this, to overcome this issue, we built up this flume where the sediment will always stay in here, so there will never be recirculation. So it's a sort of simulation of a very long eternal flume. So I'm using transparent spheres because it makes it easier to look into the bed and to see these black spheres. And I need the black spheres because They will be my tracers, so they will be the particle I will be following during my experiments. And with all the setup of many cameras, I can track the motion of these black particles that behave in the same manner of the transparent particles because they are of the same size. Sediment transport is made of two parts, the bedlow and the suspended one. We studied this differently because the bedlow is made of all the particles that jumps and saltate and rotate on the surface. And this is our interface between the water and all the sediments that stay below it. And in this interface, you can have plants growing, you can have invertebrates, you can have fishes that find hidden spots in there. And then you have the suspended one that it's made of finest particle, and they move not on the bed, but with the water, so with the entire depth of the river.
Sediment transport is a very complicated problem since different processes are involved. In the HITEC project, several researchers are studying these processes. Estimation of suspended sediment transport in rivers is important in relation to several engineering topics, not only in erosion and morphological changes, but also in the transport of contaminants and in water-sediment biota interactions. In addition to experimental modeling, numerical simulation is also an effective tool to gain that knowledge and to estimate the flow and sediment transport in rivers. In my project, I use the SPH method in order to achieve the required understanding related to the processes occur in a river and also to calculate flow properties such as velocity and shear stress. Then we will be able to estimate the rate of sediment transport. In this project, we firstly developed a SPH model for open channel flow over rough bed boundaries, and we validated the model using a set of experimental data of turbulent flows over a sloping rough bed consisting of spherical particles.
I'm studying bedrock sediment transport, looking at its interaction with the deepest layer. But there's also a bus that actually is studying the sediment transport, looking at the surface and how the sediments, so this gravel material, move on the surface. It's important to study the bedrock transport with these two different perspectives because they are complementary.
You know, science is like a baby. Baby starts crawling and then walks and then runs. So we have to understand what's happening around us. We have to understand what nature does to the society. Sediment transport phenomena is causing a lot of problems nowadays in the environment. My job is basically to investigate the kinematics of the sediments regarding very, very tiny scales, looking at the motion of every individual particle and put up the history of the particles together. So it's important to look at every single particle, and then we can derive more scientific and mathematical equations for the flux of the particles. So scientific communities, it's very important that everybody starts with the very fundamental of the phenomena, and then they can connect together. And then in a long term, or maybe in a few years perspective, we will have a better understanding on how to solve this issue relating to this sediment transport processes, such as sedimentation or erosion in the rivers, or even in the coastal areas. So it's very important that we understand and handle this job because of the consequences that the phenomena has on the human life. Rivers, they have a no-fixed boundary, so they can move.
they can move, they can change their path with time. It's very important to study that from a morphological point of view, but not just that. It's also important to study this kind of transport because rivers are also the final reception of all our discharges. And these contaminants not just move with water, they also stick to sediments and they can be buried deep into it. And then you study this because you want to find out where the potential contamination could be, but they also move downstream. So you want to understand how far that contamination moved along the river downstream.
The pollutant in the water can be any harmful substance which can affect our aquatic lives. My project is about the Global Retention Index, which is basically a single assessment parameter of surface-generated pollution. So I'm working on a parameter development which will give an idea how any watercourse is vulnerable to surface-generated pollutions, which may come from the human activities, which can be accidentally released pollution, or it might be a runoff of the water into our water courses. We are trying to trace different storage conditions according to the hydrodynamic, morphological, and also sediment compositions of specific stream. So at the beginning, we have to define what was the flow rate of the stream prior our experimental work. So once we define these flow rates and we calculate the preferential concentration of our solution that we are going to inject. First of all, we have to set our injection, and then we go downstream to install our fluorimeters at downstream sections. So we start running the fluorimeters and do continuous injection of the solutions in order to see plateau in our concentration time series. From my point of view, it's very important to study and understand this mechanism which are polluting the water, of the fresh water basically, so that we are using every day. And our life wouldn't be possible without this. So it's very important to define these characteristics, like a storage characteristic, and define the parameters which would describe this mechanism which are affecting the pollution on the stream and would allow people to use a certain parameters and in their future work and make as a decision tool for them. So my colleague Nima, he is working on a wetlands optimization, and my work partially can be related to what he is doing. And he also potentially may include the parameter that I'm working in as a global retention index to characterize retention processes in his wetland model with a parameter that I will introduce in the future.
Understanding the human activities' impact on the nature is essential for the sustainability. We have to understand the way we as humans are influencing the nature. In particular, we need to understand how pollution should be controlled. The wetland is an aquatic system, including the vegetation, and such system can be used for wastewater treatment purposes. We are trying to understand which vegetation distribution is giving the best degree of purification. So understanding the way natural wetlands work is essential for making the constructed systems. The degree of the purification we are getting from every wetland depends on different factors, including their topography, their geometry, and their vegetation in terms of the density and vegetation distribution. What I have been doing was using a mathematical model to model the wetlands so that we could get an a better understanding on how their hydrodynamic works, how their mass transport mechanisms works. So to get the maximized purification, we need to optimize every involved factor. The objective is coming up with a system which purifies the treatment with consuming almost no energy, with like the not very high maintenance costs, and it's clean because it is mimicking the nature. Wetlands are so-called laminar flow systems, extremely slow flow, which is completely different with, for instance, rivers, which are turbulent systems. In high-tech project, there are different people involved with different capabilities, but in some ways, our work is linked together.
Most of the rivers in Europe nowadays has been heavily modified. Most of them has been straightened for navigation purposes or for other purposes. But these actions actually led to decrease the biodiversity in rivers. And nowadays there is a great awareness of river restoration and river renaturalization to allow the river to have their function back again and to serve as a habitat not only for navigation or for the engineering purposes, but also to be like a habitat and to preserve life. I am working on morphodynamics due to nature-oriented structures. And the aim of my projects are to experimentally investigate the interaction between the nature-oriented structures and the river morphodynamics, and to investigate the effect of large-scale roughness element on the transport processes, and ultimately to develop a design guideline of the submerged growing, which is one type of the nature-oriented structures that will be the focus in my project. The submerged growing are a line of rocks that extending from the riverbank into the stream at a certain inclination, and they are low structures that are always submerged even during the low flow conditions, used to provide a countermeasure for bank erosion, which is very important, particularly in river bends when the flow accelerates on the outer bank and provide more bank erosion and decelerate towards the inner bank and provide deposition. So these structures actually used to redirect the flow. But in addition to that, the nature-oriented structures are environmentally sustainable measures. So they also increase the flow heterogeneity. So you get different flow velocities, different water depths, different bed material grain sizes, so different habitat, and eventually they are increasing the biodiversity.
Most of the time in natural vegetative streams, the surface resistance was neglected, but recent experiments show that this is not possible all the time. In fact, in some cases, the surface resistance can reach the 25% of the total resistance. And this can be very dangerous in some cases. For example, in the case of flood events, where underestimating the total resistance leads to underestimate the water depth, with dangerous consequences for the environment. My high-tech project deals with the surface and form resistances in natural vegetated streams. The total resistance in a natural stream is due to surface and form roughnesses. When we consider the surface roughness, we consider, for example, the bottom of the river made of sand, of gravel, or, for example, completely covered of vegetation. Considering the form roughnesses, we have these macro roughnesses, these obstacles, that can be represented by stones or vegetation as trees or bushes. What I'm going to do is to partition these different contributions. The main problem, in fact, is to describe the geometry of our natural elements, because, as we know, in nature they present complex geometries. Then, to reach the main objective, systematic experiments will be performed in a laboratory flume, combining different surface roughnesses with different form roughnesses, made of artificial elements with simple geometry that can be easily described. The experiments will be carried out performing velocity measurements with the 3D components laser Doppler anemometries and measuring the drag force acting on the form roughnesses with a drag force sensor.
And in this context, the project we are doing and the result we will get will be as an important tool in the future river renaturalization and river restoration project. So we hope that the outcome will serve as a tool in this kind of project in future.
As we know, society now demands protection from natural hazards, and it requires comprehensive care of the environment for the moment and also for the future. So in order for those societal aspirations to be satisfied, for the conditions to be met, it's necessary that reliable and credible scientific advice is provided to the environmental authorities in particular. And this advice and this guidance can only really come from systematic, fundamental research investigations into problems in which the essential physical and biological processes that control that problem have been captured, identified, analyzed, and investigated. After that stage is completed, then there's a transformation from analysis of results into some kind of predicted format. And that is a format that may take the form of guidelines, or it may take the form of a computer software package containing all of that intelligence gained from the scientific investigation. And that is a product that the environmental agencies and other societal stakeholders can utilize when they want to come to a decision regarding the solution of an environmental problem.
Politicians, of course, can make choices based on the data they get, but eventually it's the people that need to support the decisions to be taken. So to disseminate the results and know how to translate or explain the results that are obtained from scientific research, which is often quite technical and complicated, to a broader audience is an essential skill for the future generation of scientists.
So one part of the summer schools is therefore to have an open day where the Marie Curie Fellows meet school kids. They were usually around about 10 years old. The purpose of the fellows was to explain what they do to the school kids and to interact with them. By explaining a topic in a very simple way, the meaning of something becomes clear to the person who explains it.
I think studies such as the one I'm involved in here are very important because we need to protect the environment. The bottom line is we only have one planet Earth. And we have become very aware that human activity impacts environmental quality, which is bad for the environment, but frankly, it's also bad for humans. So I hope to motivate a lot of young scientists to get involved in environmental research, and especially at the exciting interface where you combine the physics, the chemistry, the biology together, where you really look at complex problems. So they're fascinating problems, and in the end, you're really going to be helping maintain our home, planet Earth.
Of course, in science, when we do science, we try to solve humankind problems, but also the main motivation probably comes not from desire to save the world, but just from curiosity. I developed career with colleagues who involved in high-tech program. We had quite developed collaboration before program started, particularly with coordinator, with Professor Andrea Marion. Then we decided to submit a proposal. Everybody knew what we want to do, interfaces, because it's the most important part and the least studied part at the boundaries between disciplines, where actually the whole biological activity occurs. The whole health of the whole river actually depends on that very narrow region. We were lucky to have also these early stage researchers who engaged in this idea to resolve this matter. Because once we resolve this matter, all other problems that currently exist and we can't address would be much easier to address.
Interfaces in the aquatic natural environment will remain a keyword for many years to come in environmental research of the natural environment. This is because interfaces are locations, spaces, sometimes tiny spaces, where life occurs, where living organisms come into contact with the inorganic matter and with each other. So the quantities, the physical and biochemical quantities that occur at interfaces are key factor, are important to determine the quality of the ecosystem and the quality of the environment. And most of all, most importantly, its capacity to sustain stresses, to sustain risks and stresses coming from anthropogenic sources, for instance, industrial pollution or urban development, but also new challenges or natural stresses like those posed by climate change, for instance. This project, after a period of 4 years, well, we've seen this fallow grow, develop, get stronger and stronger in their competences, in their abilities. We have run several projects across Europe with people working together from different institutions. At the end of the day, this has been a contact between young researchers and established scientists. It has been a contact between ecologists and fluid mechanicists. It has been a contact between people from all over the world. So after all, this high-tech project has been a human interface itself.